Good morning, everyone. Before we start, I'm being told that you have headphones just to have better sound on the back. So in case you want to have them to hear more clearly what we're talking about. There's translation too, to German. I was hoping that we would be able to speak in Spanish, but that's not the case. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming on a Sunday morning to talk about Franco, the man who marked Spain's history in the 20th century and whose legacy continues to be very important in our country, and I would say maybe also in Europe. And to do so, we have the honor to be in dialogue with Julián Casanova, who is the most relevant and most brilliant and influential Spanish historian. He's an expert on the Spanish Civil War and the whole 20th century of Spanish history. He has been publishing many remarkable books. Most of them have been translated into English and into other languages. And Julián is a very leading public intellectual in Spain. He's not only a historian, a professor of contemporary history in the University of Zaragoza. He's also a visiting professor at the Central European University here in Vienna. But he's also a leading public intellectual that promotes public discussion, public debate in Spain through his interventions in public media, in the radio, in newspapers, television, even cinema. Maybe we can talk about this afterwards, with the aim of increasing the quality of public discussion, especially related to memory, this very ambivalent topic in our contemporary societies, as a way of improving also the quality of our democracy. We're going to be talking about Franco because he has just published this extraordinary biography of Franco at the occasion of the 50th anniversary of his death. And the first question I wanted to ask him was, why did you feel the need to write a biography of Franco 50 years later?
Okay. Good morning, everyone. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for having me here today with all of you. And thank you, Judith, for accepting being in this dialogue about Franco. And well, I thought that after 4 decades of researching about Spanish history, European history, the dictatorship, was the moment to write a biography with 2 main intentions. The first one, to prove that history cannot be understood without a solid research in archives. Today, I know that opinion dominates, but without archives, there is no history. Without sources, there is no history. So the main intention was, okay, there are divided memories, political uses of the past, about Franco, Hitler, Horthy, Mussolini, but historians, we have only relative truth, but truth, and we get this truth through the archives. And the second main aim was, today there are a lot of noise and political uses of the past. And so the biography should intend to prove that goodness or evil are not historical concepts. Okay, and so we don't put people in a courtroom, process people, we research about people. Franco is one of the main figures in the 20th century in Spain, probably the most relevant in terms of impact. So that was the moment in this tension, conflict between divided memories, Franco's historiography, and political uses of the past. Because today, and I finish this first approach, today there are a lot of noise about Franco. How do you teach Franco in the high schools? Is Franco a good man, a modernizer? Is a criminal, war criminal? Is he a fascist? Is he a good man? No? So we have all these kind of versions, and only through a solid research we can talk about Franco in Spain and in the world.
So we're here in Vienna, and our audience is perhaps not as familiar with Spanish history and with the figure of Franco. So I was wondering whether you could maybe describe the person behind the dictator, no? Briefly describe this man that went to Africa, then was a military education, and then became a fighter for the Civil War and a dictator for 40 years.
Yeah, it's a good question to start with. Franco was born in 1892. He was 3 years younger than Hitler, 9 years younger than Mussolini. The three of them belonged to the war generation. Robert Wall established this concept of war generation, people who fought in the Great War. Spain didn't participate in the Great War, in the First World War, but Franco was to Africa, and his formation was in this brutality of the colonial war. I defend in my book that Africa was the university for Franco, and the coup d'etat and the Civil War was the doctoral dissertation of Franco. And so at the end, war. And he defined himself, I am a soldier, I'm a military man. And this is very confusing because many people think that all dictatorships in the period and all dictators were military. But Mussolini wasn't, Hitler wasn't, Stalin wasn't. And so Franco always thought that the army and himself were the saviors of Spain, the saviors of the Christian civilization against the enemies. At the beginning, socialists, atheists, then Bolsheviks, communists, then Jews, and finally the Freemasonry. He was obsessed with the role of the Masons in Spain. And so his formation in Africa was Spain lost the colonies, the last rest of the colonies at the end of the 19th century because of the liberal politicians. And Africa would be the revival of the empire. And he thought that he was the man chosen by the providence, by the divine providence to save Spain. He organized with other Africanists, we call Africanists the military who fought in Africa, in the Spanish Morocco. They organized a coup d'etat against the Republic, 1936. The coup d'etat split Spain in two, and opened the way to a civil war. And so that means that the civil war was the moment in which they apply everything learned in Africa and in the peninsula. They won the war, and after winning the war, Franco was the main authority without any discussion of these Africanists that had this coup d'etat. And so Franco, on the contrary to Mussolini and Hitler, in 1936, he wasn't a hooligan, an outsider. He was a general, a general of the Spanish army. But nobody had written a biography before 1936. In spite of the fact that probably he was the main general in the Spanish army. But everything changed when he got the pinnacle of power in the Civil War. Since this moment on, from this moment on, Franco was the main authority. At the beginning, connected to fascism, and after the defeat of fascism, connected to the states from the 50s, after the Korean War. And so my thesis is that Franco, in the international sphere, he was a dependent dictator, and in Spain he was powerful until the end. Powerful man, first because the repression, the assassination of thousands of people was a kind of investment, long-term investment until the end. And until the end, Franco and the victors of the war always remembered to Spaniards the pact of blood established through the coup d'etat and the civil war until the last moment. And finally, if you compare Mussolini and Hitler with Franco, Mussolini died, was assassinated, and then you have this picture of Mussolini upside down, Piazzale Loreto in Milano. Hitler committed suicide, and Franco was buried as a kind of pharaoh in the 70s. And so it's interesting to see this. And finally, Franco is still in Spain because there is a long shadow of Francoism. At the end of the 20th century, it seemed like everything was history. Now with Vox and the ultra-right movement, Franco is again with us, but not as a criminal, war criminal, or a man who organized the coup d'etat, won the civil war, but a kind of modernizer, and a modernizer paving the way for democracy. And so the manipulation finishes with this. He was a modernizer, but he paved the way for democracy in Spain. So it's the upside-down history, no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're talking about this dictatorship that lasted for 40 years. And in your book, you mentioned that he was not a very charismatic leader, that he was not a particularly politically talented man, that nevertheless, he stayed in power for 40 years and managed to concentrate all this power without little disputes within the Francoists. And you seem to defend the thesis that it was thanks to the international context that helped him. No? It's like almost by chance that he managed to stay in power and keep this long dictatorship alive. Can you tell us a bit more about this international context and the evolution that he made at the beginning, this connection with Hitler and Mussolini, and then the shift that he progressively did towards the United States?
It's a good question, because in Spain, from the left, many people neglected Franco, telling us that Franco was a man without any charisma. If we take the charismatic perception of the charisma by Max Weber, for instance, Kershaw does this with Hitler. Charisma is applied with populism, demagogues who knew how to organize masses, the voice, the speech. Franco wasn't charismatic in that sense. The charisma was to win a war, to be the savior of Spanish civilization, to have the blessing of the Catholic Church from the beginning, combining with anti-clericalism. And so anti-clericalism and clericalism play an important role in the Spanish Civil War. So the Spanish Civil War has many wars, and one of them, very important, was the conflict between the church and anti-clericalism. A long tradition of social movements defending that the Catholic Church was only in favor of the rich people, abandoning the poor, controlling the monopoly of education, these kind of things. No? And so Franco died in 1975. He had 3 more decades than Mussolini and Hitler in rewriting history. And he rewrote history. First of all, he tried to prove that he was the man, and thanks to him, Spain didn't participate in the Second World War. In fact, he tried and wanted to be seated at the same table as Mussolini and Hitler. It wasn't possible, given the situation of Spain. After 1945, he rewrote history in the sense that he was the anti-communist in the Cold War, and so he stressed Catholicism. Catholicism and fascism, he said, are not compatible. No? Nationalism and Catholicism are the main identity signs in Spain. So we are not fascist, we are Catholic. And he established, according to him, an organic democracy, or corporatist democracy. No? So he presented himself as a gentleman saving Spain now from communism. In the 50s, he started to have the support of the United States. It was very important. After being a few years a pariah for Britain, for France, for United States, in 1953, United States and Spain signed a treatment of military aid support, no, having or establishing military bases in Spain. And so United States was very important at that moment. And Franco said, after signing the treatment, at last, I won the Civil War. And he realized that that was the real moment in his life. 3 presidents of the United States came to Spain to visit Franco. Eisenhower in 1959, Nixon in 1970, and Gerald Ford at the end of May 1975, a few months before Franco died. And then the situation in Spain after 20 years of autarky was very, very bad. Was about to bankruptcy, and at the end of the 50s, reports from the main economic international institutions obliged Franco to change the rhythm of the economics. And he expelled phalangists, fascists. They didn't know anything about economy, and he incorporated people, technocrats, people from Opus Dei. And at the beginning, he was very, he reacted against this, but finally he appropriated this change of this turning point, trying to tell people that before the savior of the Spanish civilization, Christian civilization, he was also the main modernizer of Spain. And everything changed. It's true that there was a boom in economics in Spain, but you have to realize that in the 60s, Spain had something like almost 30 million people. More than 4 million people, 4.5 million, went from rural society to the cities. More than 3 million went to abroad for work reasons. And so Spain was a society in movement. Many things changed, and before, I mean, was the transition from repression to a perception that there was some option to fight Franco with new social movements. And so people started to join committees, clandestine committees. The church started to change. Some priests, Christians for socialism, started to connect with communists in the clandestinity. And so it's a second part of the dictatorship, very different. No? So you have 2 moments. The first one until the end of the 50s, and the second one. But Franco was always the man in charge of everything good passing in Spain. No? And so it's interesting how Franco, there is a myth about austerity, no? Franco and his family were very austere. Now we know that they were very corrupted. He died rich. He allowed to reach in a crazy way his family, and not only his family, the people who were in this red or net of social, cultural, and political friendship. No?
Maybe because of this evolution of the dictatorship, and also because he coexisted with Hitler and Mussolini, we tend to think that Franco's dictatorship was a soft one, no? And it's kind of another myth that it was a second-hand dictatorship and that it was not so hard. It's still today in Spain, a lot of people are saying that with Franco, we used to live better. No? It's kind of a common thing that we hear in the streets and in the political life. And today, no, with the rise of these new kinds of authoritarian regimes that we're living through, I was wanting to ask you if we could give it a name. Can we call Franco a fascist, or was he a dictator, an authoritarian leader? What is the precise name for that man and the dictatorship he led?
Well, the coup d'etat in July 1936 was a kind of reactionary coup d'etat. Spain had a long tradition of pronunciamientos, coup d'etat, in 19th century, 20th century. But the coup d'etat became an international civil war because Hitler and Mussolini decided from the beginning to break the Treaty of Non-Intervention and to help Franco. So the help of Franco, of Mussolini and Hitler was a key factor for the victory, no? A key factor for mobilization, a key factor for adding more brutality to the repression during the war. Something like 100,000 people were killed in the rear guard because the Spanish Civil War broke the border between front and rear guard. More than 100,000 people, and 40,000 people were assassinated after the Civil War until 46. And of course, yesterday was the 50th anniversary of the last 5 people executed by Franco, 27 of September 1975. And so he was killing until the last moment. Until 1945, I think there is no doubt that Franco participated, incorporated fascism, and was a combination of the long tradition of reactionary Catholic reactionary movements and fascism. But this is also fascism in France and in Italy. No, in France, they have a long tradition of reactionary Action Française, no? And then fascism was introduced with this legacy of conservative, ultra-reactionary thinking and ideas, and in Spain, in Italy as well. When people say Franco wasn't a fascist because he had a close relationship to the Catholic Church, what about Italy? Italy, Mussolini coexisted with the king, coexisted with the Vatican. They signed the Letran Treaty, no, between the state and the Vatican. And so my position as historian, and I see historians here, no? My position as historian is that comparative history is a key to understand history. So for me, this biography, the main challenge is how to combine a micro perception of Spain, and using at the same time the telescope and the comparative history. Comparative history is not parallel history. Comparative history is similarities and differences between nations, similarities and differences between ideas, between social movements, between people. And so Franco was a fascist in his regime until 1945, and then he tried to start this idea that Catholicism and not fascism was the main key factor. No? And so the church and religion was a kind of smoke screen after the Second World War. And Franco used the Catholic Church. And in exchange, the Catholic Church was very thankful to Franco because Franco was the man who liberated the church from anti-clericalism, a violent anti-clericalism during the Civil War. So it's an interchange of favors no? Between Franco, the church, the institutions. No? In the long term, you cannot have a definition, a single definition of a regime lasting 40 years. Do you imagine Mussolini and Hitler winning the war? No? I mean, the radicalization, everything would be different. So Franco revisited everything in history. In family, for instance, his father abandoned home in 1907. The same year Franco was to the AKADEMIE in Toledo, 14 years, he was 14 at that moment. Was the same year Hitler wasn't admitted here in the AKADEMIE. And so Franco in Raza, Raza was a script by Franco, was a film in 1941. And in Raza, Franco put his father, instead of this drunk man abandoning the home, in the film was a man, a hero dying, fighting for Spain in Cuba against the traitor politicians. So it's incredible how he revised. And then finally, we are talking about history, but for 40 years, the schools, year after year, in the schools, people didn't study the 20th century, didn't study at all. Spanish history. The Spanish history was finishing at the end of 18th century. The Austrians, but not the Bourbons, were the important part in Spanish history, and the grandeur of the empire instead of the decline of the empire. And so it's a kind of sacred history instead of a real history. No?
When you talk about this comparative approach, which is so important in your book and in general for the study of history, can we also establish some parallelism between the personal and political figures of Franco, Hitler, and Mussolini? No? You say in your book that the three of them were the sons of very authoritarian fathers. This is kind of almost a cliché.
And Stalin as well.
And Stalin as well. The three of them were inspired by fascism, and fascism was very important. You also say that the three of them used corruption as a way of creating loyalty around them. But there are a lot of differences between them, the three of them. Could you please maybe develop that idea? This idea, for instance, that in Spain, it was more important, violence was more important at the beginning of the regime and not at the end, and that's why we still we keep this idea that Franco was kind of not such a violent dictatorship, and on the other two cases it was the other way around. It was that violence was more important at the end. Can you please tell us a bit about the differences between the three men?
Well, the main difference at the beginning is the background. Mussolini was a former socialist, and he mobilized masses in order to take power. Hitler mobilized masses in order to take power. Franco participated in a coup d'etat. In a classic at the beginning coup d'etat. This is a very different perception of taking power. No? And so, la conquista del poder, in the case of Franco, came substituting politics and putting arms instead of politics since July 1936. It's true that Franco, after the Civil War, he experienced the first period, the period more cruel with the vanquished. So Spain was divided between victors and vanquished. And then he had time to relax after the blessing of the Catholic Church, and especially after the treatment with and the agreement with United States. In the case of Mussolini and Hitler, the period of radicalization happened at the end. For instance, talking about Mussolini, famous historians, Renzo de Felice, thought that the first 20 years of fascism in Spain, there was a kind of consensus in Italian society. But at the end is the invasion by the American troops, the Republic of Salò, crazy anti-Semitic movement at that moment, and in Germany was the same radicalization at the end, no? And so people think that Franco, in Spain, for instance, people who revise history of Franco in favor of Francoism, they think that, well, there was a civil war, but in the civil war, everybody was killing. All were responsible. All were guilty. This perception that a collective guilty in a civil war. After the civil war, Franco had to punish the population because there was anti-clericalism, there were revolution. Barcelona was the symbol of this anti-clerical and collective revolution by anarchists, no? And so Franco had to punish this. And then the period of modernization was the main key factor in order to understand the evolution of the dictatorship. In terms of personality, they were very different, but I think the main difference with Mussolini, and especially with Hitler, is that the civil war was a kind of inner phenomenon in Spanish society. Hitler and Mussolini were to other countries. The responsibility was also invading other countries. So it's like Franco could be a minor dictator compared to these cruel dictators who, in the case of Hitler, could occupy the whole of Europe through the arms. No? But at the end, they share many things. And advisors from fascist Italy and Nazi Germany convinced Franco that he needed a state, a fascist state, instead of this kind of camp army instead of the state. No? And so they created a single party, and the single party lasted until the last moment, until 1975. And I insist, Franco wanted to be seated at the same table. No. And he asked many things, and in exchange, he couldn't offer anything to Hitler at that moment. And Franco and Mussolini and Hitler knew that. And it was Mussolini who said to Hitler, leave alone Franco. Franco is going to be our friend, but they are not going to participate in the war.
Today, even today, Spanish politics, we tend to think, this myth of Franco as being kind of the savior of peace, of order, after so many times of disorder, the fights with anarchists, socialists, communists. He presented himself as the savior of this order, this peaceful man. Whereas we know the political repression that he conducted over the whole dictatorship. What was this slogan that he used to use? España una grande y libre. One big and free. What were these slogans passed through generations meant? What did they mean? Why was one single Spain a big one, and a free Spain? What did that exactly mean?
Well, it was a kind of noble dream, noble because it was to revive the old empire, but novel but impossible dream. And was a kind of unity, order, and patience, because they knew that Spain wasn't an important country that moment. But the shadow of this was enormous. I mean, at the beginning of the transition, for the first 20 years, only historians started to revise history. The mass graves were there. Nobody was interested in the mass graves. The saying for many politicians were, look forward to the future, don't go back to the past. The politics of memories started to appear in Spain at the end of the 90s. So the long shadow was ignorance for many people, trying to hide the past for many people, especially from the people coming from the right. And people from the left felt still the fear in the families. I remember when I started my doctoral dissertation at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, and I tried to incorporate oral history. And at the beginning of the 80s, nobody wanted to talk about their families, the fear. And if you were interested in talking to women from the left, you had the documents. They participated in syndicates, in trade unions. They participated in collectives. And they said at the beginning of the 80s, no, it was my husband. They didn't want to talk. And so this long shadow was something. And so when we try to revise history, to revise everything, it appeared something very, very strong from the right, from the social order. And he said, okay, all were responsible in the Spanish Civil War.
Same level.
This is a collective. Guilty. Hispanists did the same, from abroad. And so we need reconciliation. So historians, we started to tell for the first time we need education. We need history and to teach history in secondary schools. And we need to incorporate 20th century, the whole 20th century in Spain and abroad, to the education. And so to incorporate the 20th century, unfortunately, for many people, needed to incorporate the real history of the mass graves, the real history of missing, the real history of how many privileges and favors got the victors of the war, how they divided Spain between victors and vanquished, and the vanquished were humiliated. Franco's regime was a male regime. No woman seated in a ministry ever, but the people around Franco were a club of gentlemen, Catholic, who share double moral, lies, privileges, corruption. And of course, in the first 20 years, they obliged to the vanquished, to the rest of the population, they stimulated assassination, they stimulated hunger, they stimulated ignorance. And so this is the point. And I insist that at the end of the 20th century, it seemed like everything was in a good way. Researching, education, trying to have this comparative perception of human rights in the world. And after the crisis of 2008, with the revival of the new ultra-rightist movement, the appearance for the first time in Spain after Franco of a strong ultra-rightist movement, the history of Francoism was revised. and they recovered the darkest part of Francoism, but trying to legitimate everything in name of religion, God, and Christian civilization. This is the box position about Francoism at this moment.
Yes, let's talk about the present, Franco's legacy in the contemporary Spanish politics. You're talking about Vox, the Spanish ultra-right party that is increasingly present in our Congress, in our political life, and also the forecast in the polls are increasingly important. But the fact that Franco died in bed also conditioned the influence and the legacy of Franco in today's Spanish politics. The monarchy was a monarchy that was created under, he nominated the king.
1969?
Exactly, and then and the king assumed the principles of the national movement of Franco. So the fact that the political regime that is currently in Spain is endorsed by Franco. We also have a huge memorial, El Valle de los Caídos, that is also very controversial in terms of what it represents, this idea of the dictatorship being shown still in public spaces. And this idea of this revival among also youngsters, we can see a lot of Franco revisit in TikTok, in Instagram, where he appears as being a very cool figure, very funny person, very this kind of revisitation of his political legacy. What has gone wrong in terms of the memory of the dictatorship of Franco in contemporary Spanish politics?
Okay, my biography finishes in November 1975, so it's a classic biography. I don't analyze in this book the long shadow of Francoism, but I did this in other places. And first of all, I think that there was in Spain for a long time a deficit, a lack of education in the schools. No question about this. People with 50 and older, 50-year-old and older, didn't learn history in the schools, with exceptions, of course, but broadly speaking, they didn't get knowledge about history, 20th century history in their schools. And so this is very important for this. Then the nature of the transition. At the beginning, the nature of the transition was we need to look forward to the future. We need a democratization. A dictator of 40 years is a long-term dictator. And nobody can think that after 40 years of the dictatorship, you have a miracle. No, you have a miracle, and the transition is immaculate from the beginning. But they created the perception that we had an immaculate transition with the king presiding over the transition until Juan Carlos was in decline in 2014. No? And so the narrative about transition is also a very interesting thing. When Podemos and the new social movements started to be influent in Spain, they thought that there was a kind of regime named the regime of 1978, the Constitution. I think that the transition was a conflict from above and from below, a violent conflict, successful after many years of lack of democracy, many years of violence, many years of humiliation for many people. So the transition was successful in that sense. It wasn't immaculate. It wasn't peaceful only. During the 2, 3, 4 years, the transition was very violent. We had a coup d'etat, a serious attempt of coup d'etat in 1981. You can have many pictures of Spain, concentration camps, assassinations, and you find these pictures in other places. probably more pictures about this violence in other places. But having a civil guard with a pistol entering the parliament in 1981, you don't have this picture. You have to explain this. And you explain this because until the last moment, the army was united in favor of Francoism. Many of them had fought the Spanish Civil War. Many of them were the sons of the people who fought the Spanish Civil War. And so this coup d'etat was a turning point at that moment, a turning point which benefited the king. So the king was this kind of immaculate
savior,
man, the savior, and everybody agreed more or less about this. But at the same time, the year after, the Socialist Party took power with an absolute majority, and many people thought the transition was finished. After 5, 6 years, very complicated, at the end, the Socialist Party, the sons of the Socialist Party, defeated with the Republic, were in power with Felipe González. And so the transition, there was also a boom in terms of social benefits, in terms of education, in terms of economic boom. And so many people thought that it was a good place to live after so many years of violence, of underdeveloped country. So this is more or less the narrative today. But something appeared in the last year, and it's not only in Spain. There is a revision of history, country after country. And this revision tries to tell people that this infame past, everybody has an infame past in Europe and other countries. They discuss the main actors, who are the responsible. And so fascism is a kind of moderate movement for many people because communism was the main enemy. Fascism killed, but communism killed more. So there is a kind of playing cards between communism, fascism, and looking for guilty people in the 30s and the 40s.
My last question before we go to the Q&A is about precisely this. If we see the legacy of these men, these dictators from the 30s, in the light of the today world's politics, in your book you state this idea of they were 3 very charismatic leaders offering very simple, extreme responses to very profound political and social crises, also revising their own past. It was the case of Franco, this idea of the imperial Spain. When we see today, in Trump, Orban, all these new far-right leaders, a little bit all over the place, what are the parallelisms between the 30s and today's new leaders?
Yeah. Well, today, like in the 30s, many people thought that they needed simple explanations for complex phenomena, and so they got this simplification of the world. Today we see this in Trump, with Orban, with many people in the world. But I think there is a difference. Until now, we don't have arms, paramilitaristic movements, and the states have the control of the means of coercion. And it's not the same. I mean, in the 30s, or in Colombia, or in other places, the state, or Mexico, perhaps the state is not in the absolute control of the means of coercion. That is why it was so threatening to see the assault to the Congress in the United States. Do you imagine this assault to the Congress in the parliament in Germany, or here in the parliament? So now we have this kind of people who think that they need simple solutions for complex phenomena. And besides, I think there is a ultra-nationalism around all the countries, a reaction against gender and feminism, of course, and a reaction against the immigration. And they are the three new components that were, in some sense, absent at the end of the 20th century. No? And so, you know, in Spain, when I go to the high schools, because I am very connected to the high schools, I insist that the education in the high schools are very interesting, relevant for us. Usually people in the university abandoned this. And I'm going to the schools, and now people, the professors or the teachers there, some of them are former students, they tell me that now it's a kind of fashion, it's a kind of reaction, it's a kind of, let's say, anti-establishment to be ultra-rightist, to be anti-gender and anti-feminism, to be in favor of rich people and people, white people up, and the poor people, they neglect the poor people. And this is new. This is new in the secondary schools. No? They don't care about history, except a few. No? And the progressive people are disappearing. I mean, that people who were fighting in favor of human rights, or they were empathetic with this kind of events like Gaza, these people are disappearing in the secondary schools. No? And so we have a problem. We have a problem. We have a breakdown of values, very clear in the United States, a breakdown of values of democracy. And it's very difficult to defend a welfare state and democracy for these people who think that the future is abolished for them, and they don't have any future. So yeah, we have to analyze this. The left, you can put the blame on the left as well, of course, no? And the disappearance of the traditional parties, trade unions. But at the end, we have a problem in terms of democracy, not a problem in terms only of political parties. And education, we thought that education was the key factor, and now education doesn't prove as positive as we thought.
Okay, on that rather pessimist note, we open up the discussion to the audience. There's a question up there, and here, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, maybe we can gather them, so not just to be on time.
I have a question concerning street names. I remember very vividly my first visits to Spain. And I was in Fuerteventura, and I came across the main street where all social life took place. And to my big surprise, it was named Avenida, maybe even Generalissimo Franco. And I imagined for some time, well, maybe this is some kind of comrade of Christopher Columbus, who maybe traveled from there, because I could not imagine that the main street in a Spanish city in the 2000s would be named after a fascist dictator. But then, thanks to the local authorities, at some point there was another plaque that said, well, this is the Caudillo de España, and well, we are proud of him, because that's the way we think about him. And I had similar experience in other Spanish cities, and also Spanish cities that were for a very long time, for decades, governed by the Spanish left. I think, if I remember correctly, I saw streets named in Cordoba, where I think even the Communist Party had the mayor for some time, named after comrades in arms of Franco. Plaques, I think in Aranjuez, commemorating Franco's visits to the town and praising him. So it's everywhere you went to Spain, and also in cities that were governed by the left. So my question would be, why did the left not challenge this Francoist inheritance earlier? I know about the problems of the transition and the Francoist elites that were in place and so on, but why was this renaming of street names so difficult, even when the left was in power for a very long time, for decades, with majorities?
Correct.
Yes, because otherwise we won't be in time.
Yeah. We are in a hurry. I'm sorry, I have a plane. Yeah.
Could you comment on Franco's relationship to Latin American dictators, strongmen, authoritarians? Was he inspired by them? Did he support them?
Yeah. Latin America, you mean? Yeah.
Aquí, yeah, Michael.
I'm wondering whether the 1953 agreement with America on defense has had an effect on Spanish ambivalence about NATO and reluctance to support Ukraine, given the ways in which these defense associations are associated with the Franco regime.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, I collect the questions.
Yeah. I don't know if we have time for 2 other questions. What do you think?
Too many, but thank you very much, because it's a proof that you are interested in the point.
Go ahead.
Okay, first of all, we had in Spain a big debate about the places of memory. No, I didn't answer about the Valle de los Caídos, and not only the places of memory, meaning the names of the streets, but monuments, and especially the Valle de los Caídos was the symbiosis between religion and politics, no? And nobody knew for many years what to do with the Valle de los Caídos. And finally, a few years ago, Franco was exhumated, no? But Franco was there for many years. The position of historians is not to destroy the places of memory and to explain the places of memory, nor reignify the places of memory, but to explain the places of memory, and this is my perception. No, Latin American dictators, some of them are buried in Spain. Spain was the cemetery of many dictators, many fascists, many Nazis. No, and so this is the paradox. No, people, Republicans, socialists, anarchists, communist people, they died abroad, and Spain was the cemetery for many of them. With Pinochet, Franco didn't meet Franco and Pinochet, but they interchanged many letters since September 1973. Franco sent the chief of the army in Spain, 75, to give Pinochet the main condecoration at that moment, and Pinochet was the main figure presided over the funeral of Franco. Trujillo is buried in Spain, Batista is buried in Spain, and so the interchange was very fluent. And also with Salazar. Franco and Salazar met seven times, and this is a very important relationship. And by the way, Franco never traveled abroad after 1949 when he went to Lisbon to see Salazar. And Salazar never traveled to the colonies or outside Portugal except 6 times to go to the Spanish border to meet with Franco. So this is very interesting, no? The Iberian Peninsula dictators. Well, it's true that the legacy and the shadow of the agreement with United States influence the transition and the position of the left against NATO in Spain. And of course, there was a kind of anti-Americanism as well because of the bases there. And the transition reflected all of this, no? Probably the Socialist Party had also an ambivalent position at the beginning, but with Zapatero and Sanchez, I think they changed a lot the position in international affairs. No? When Sanchez started to defend Gaza and this kind of positions in Europe, everybody in the international relations sphere, atmosphere was in favor of Sanchez, but many people hate Sanchez in Spain. So this is a very interesting paradox. No? And finally, and I would like to insist that in Spain, many people think that Spain is different. We have the history, the cruelest history in the world. We are people maybe inclined to civil war. We don't care about the past. We discuss a lot about the past. And I always said to Spaniards, go to Hungary, go to Poland, go to the United States, go to Russia, go to other places, and you are going to prove or to check that the problem is not to discuss the past, the problem is to have an infame past in the 20th century, when many people in Europe thought that the situation in Europe was civilized, and all of a sudden, after 1914, ethnic cleansing, Holocaust, genocide happened in Europe. No outside Europe, no in the colonies, in Europe. And so we are part of this infame past, and we have to confront the past through education, transmitting knowledge in places like this, on the media. And so we need a commitment. We need a commitment beyond the academia, beyond the ivory tower, beyond our learnings and teachings in the university. And I know this is very painful sometimes, because you get in the social networks, you get insults, you get many other things, not polite people talking about you, but I am in favor of this commitment. And so thank you very much for your attention. It was a real pleasure to come back to Vienna, to Austria, and to share with all of you this morning at the Academy. Thank you.